Welcome, everyone. It's just now 6, so I think I'll give us another minute or two for any latecomers, and then we'll get started. Thanks for being here. Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. So we might have a few more latecomers, but we have a bit of an introduction to do yet. So hopefully any latecomers will get here before we get really into the discussion. So hello and everyone, and welcome to our final presentation of Riverside and the World, History and Memory of Peace and War. I'm Teresa Hanley, the project director for the Foundation's Toward Peace project. And on behalf of the Mission Inn Foundation, thank you for joining us these last several weeks. If this is your first time with us, welcome. And I want to be sure that you can view the previous presentations, recordings of them. Go to the Foundation's website, missioninmuseum, all one word, .org, to find those links. We are proud that Toward Peace is made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Visit calhum.org to learn more about them and the many fine programs they support throughout California. I would also like to thank our local sponsors, Judith Awe, Sally and Chuck Beatty, Kathy Wright and Dwight Tate, and Walter Parks. As has been mentioned a few times during our presentations, an interpretive exhibition on Frank Miller and peace is a major component of our project. It has been delayed due to COVID, but will open later this year in the Mission Inn Museum's gallery in downtown Riverside. So watch for information on that on the Foundation's website. Also, during these introductions, I have frequently mentioned that part of our project is to explore how Miller's legacy of peace activism might influence us as individuals and as a community. Our Toward Peace planning group now turns its attention to this next phase of the project. So also watch for opportunities for future programs and activities to engage with us in this next phase. We will need your participation to fully explore Miller's legacy. So briefly now, our usual Zoom housekeeping. We have muted audience microphones and disabled audience cameras, and we have also disabled the chat function. So please post any questions that you have in the Q&A, and our speakers will try to address them following the moderated discussion. Tonight's presentation is a wrap-up of our series. Professor Kenya Davis Hayes of California Baptist University has prepared prompt questions for our speakers and will moderate our discussion. To quickly remind you of our speakers, we have heard from Dr. Jennifer Keene of Chapman University, who provided us with an overview of the First World War's significance for America. Dr. Mona Siegel of California State University, Sacramento, who joined me on a discussion of some of the women who influenced Frank Miller's peace activities. And last week, she discussed women's peace activism at the war's end and after World War I. Dr. Emily McEwen historical resources consultant told us of Frank Miller's early efforts to develop a World War I memorial. And Dr. Mark Levitch, an art historian and founding director of the World War I Memorial Inventory Project, gave us an overview of World War I memorials around the nation. And Vince Moses, independent historian and curator, told the story of Riverside Soldiers Memorial and Municipal Auditorium. So now we're all going to join together in a little bit of discussion, moderated by Dr. Davis Hayes. So I am pleased to turn tonight's proceedings over to Dr. Kenya Davis Hayes.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Good evening all, and welcome to the final installation of the Riverside and the World, History and Memory of Peace and War speaker series. As Ms. Hanley mentioned, my name is Professor Kenya Davis Hayes. Over these past 5 weeks, the Mission Inn Foundation has brought together key scholars to articulate the legacy and impact of World War I on the nation generally. And the series has also specifically highlighted the City of Riverside's efforts to memorialize the war and serve as a space to construct a lasting global peace. In our discussion this evening, we will recap our 5-week journey and piece together the work of our brilliant scholars in an effort to create a clear image of World War I's impact upon the nation, Riverside, and ultimately the international peace movement. I'm so excited about this discussion. With this discussion, I will start generally looking at World War I's broad history, and then narrow our discussion to focus more on Riverside and its role in the peace movement. And so that launches our discussion and brings me to Professor Keene. Hello, Jennifer, how are you this evening? You're muted.
We're never going to have to not, we're never going to have to not say that. That's hilarious. A year in, we still don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah. It's okay. It brings humanity to us all. So I think it's totally fine. Right. Yeah. Okay, as we're going to start this discussion very broadly, in your opinion, what were World War I's greatest impacts on American society? And in what ways did it serve as a national and global turning point? I think it's fair to say that a lot of people overlook World War I as a major event in American history, at least. So what are your thoughts on its impacts?
So you're giving me the whole hour to answer that question, right?
Yes.
So that's a huge question. So I think that what I'll just do is just give a few, sort of top 3 maybe in each category, and that'll help, I think, maybe also connect to some of the comments that the other panelists will make. And I just want to also, take this as an opportunity to really congratulate the Mission Inn and Teresa on a fantastic series of events. Really learned a lot from all of you, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to kind of have a closing conversation. So I would say that when we think about for the United States, and especially the overlooked aspects of the war, that one, I think, big category is the opportunities that the war provided for social movements to both think about new strategies, new messaging, new recruitment methods, and in some cases even new goals. And I would put into this category the temperance movement, the female suffrage movement, and the civil rights movement. And I think that we can talk about the varying degrees of success, short-term versus long-term, that these movements had. But I think in all of these movements, World War I was an opportunity that they seized, and they really made the most of that in terms of furthering their goals. The second big category I would say in terms of significance for the U.S. is the way that the war demonstrated and allowed the development of a new role for the federal government in American society. And when we think about the powers that the government had to mobilize the economy and manpower, the idea of having a federally orchestrated propaganda effort, the idea of new civil liberties, curtailment of civil liberties, even having to now define what that was with the Supreme Court getting involved, that we really saw kind of the future. This was not, a done and that's it change. It wasn't that these new powers were permanently bestowed upon the federal government, but we really saw a sort of prototype for how in moments of crisis, the government was going to turn to that blueprint again and again and again, to the extent that now you know, the difference between a wartime state and what it does and a peacetime state and what it does is almost impossible to discern. And so we really see that 100-year trajectory really taking off. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in the New Deal, the next big crisis, a lot of the managers who came up with New Deal solutions had participated in the mobilization of the country during the war and looked back on that as actually instructive. And so that's just, you know, we could keep going with those examples. The third big area, I think, is Wilsonianism. Wilson's vision, as much as we can critique him as an individual, we still live in it. We still live in that value structure. We still live with that ideology. It still provides the framing for both our role in the world and the debates that we have about our role in the world. And I think that it really does make his wartime speeches and certainly his viewpoint important for us to understand, because it really has laid out so much of our future. The world is like, okay, so now let's go to the world. So the world, I'm going to be really brief here. I'm going to say Russian Revolution. Think about how different the world might look without the Russian Revolution. The Paris peace settlement, and here I would say not just Versailles, but the entire peace settlement in terms of the way that it really attempted to reconstruct Europe. I think its flaws and the perceptions of its flaws, which I would put into two different categories, did in a sense lay the foundation for World War II. I don't think it caused World War II, but I think it created a set of conditions in which the war obviously came to pass. And then the third category I would put the impact on imperial empires. And here, I think, much like in the US, what we're really seeing are the beginnings of trends that would come to fruition later in the century. The war does end empires in Europe. I mean, we kind of forget that the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and German empires, and to a certain extent, the Russian Empire, do not survive World War I. So the sense of destruction of empires in Europe, the war accomplishes that. But we certainly see that in the short term. And then in the long term, I mean, the way that a European war turns into a global war is because of the existence of empires. And we'd start to see fracturing there, you know, first like in the Commonwealth with Australia, Canada, and New Zealand really taking on more autonomy within the empire, controlling their foreign policies differently. And then obviously later on in the century, where we really do see the actual destruction of colonial empires. So I think that all of these things really, some short term, some longer term, really mark the First World War as a major turning point in American history and world history. I think that's pretty good for such a big question. So,
I thought that was incredible. Yeah. I really, really did. So well done.
I'm sorry to be complimenting myself, but that's a tough question. Anyway.
I applaud that. And I think that what you said was really fascinating in terms of so many shifts in terms of the responsibilities of the federal government. Of course, we have these global changes. The world will never be the same. And as I'm thinking about all of your work, I know, just full disclosure, I sent them questions and they were in a particular order. But once you started to talk, I'm going to change the order in terms of the linkages, right? So the world is in incredible flux during and after World War I. And as you were speaking, it actually sort of jogged my memory about Dr. McEwen's topic she did.
I'll unmute myself.
Yes, there we go.
I will mute myself.
So Professor Levitch and Professor Moses, I'll get to you guys in a minute, or Doctors Levitch and Moses. In your lecture, Emily, you assert that Frank Miller's efforts to construct a World War I memorial in the Mission Inn, in Riverside, shrinks the difference. It was an effort to shrink the difference between the people of Riverside and the drama of World War I. And I thought that was such a compelling assertion and something that I never thought about when we think about bringing pieces from abroad, regardless of where they come from. Can you elaborate on that desire to bring bits of World War I home during the post-war era?
Of course.
Go ahead.
Well, I was really excited about the question because I get to talk about some of the things that I get very excited about. And so I think, you know, yeah, this impulse to shrink the distance between Riverside and the battlefields of World War I through the installation of this, you know, Calvary from a Belgian Catholic cathedral, right? So he wanted to use an artifact. You know, I think it has a few components that really speak to the authority of objects, especially at this time in history when we're looking, you know, in the teens and 20s. So, you know, in the U.S. from, you know, the mid 1870s, I would say, through the 1920s was really this golden age of museum building in the US. So this is where we get these large public museums and the building of private collections. And, you know, they were being built for entertainment and education of the masses. You know, this was appropriate entertainment to go, you know, go to the museum. And the thinking really was that through, you know, the proper arrangement of things from the past, right, that usually in a, you know, a linear chronological order, that we could unlock the mysteries of the past, that we could see progress unfolding and understand, you know, understand human history and our place in it. And so objects of the past, especially in this time, were endowed with this, you know, authenticity, almost an inherent essence of the past and the people that created that specific object. So I think, you know, when we look first at Miller's desire to bring this piece of the war back to Riverside for a memorial, we need to kind of think about it in that specific context of the time and the reverence for these real things of history. And I think secondly, you know, this has been noted from I think all of the speakers, you know, that we have this conflict that didn't take place on American soil. It took place so far away, and it was not as if most people could go, you know, in the US could go mourn at a sacred site like a battlefield. So Miller, you know, he already has this penchant for collecting, and he has, you know, these international connections that he's developed over the years, you know, enabled him to secure this real artifact, and he was able to bring a piece of the war home. And, you know, this piece, this Calvary, showed the scars. It had been shot at, it had been bombed, and he wanted to create this place of, you know, a potential place of pilgrimage and reflection where you could actually experience, you know, this authentic remnant of the war. But, you know, it was also an artifact, right? It was inanimate. So the Calvary in and of itself was less complicated than, you know, the actual human soldiers who were returning with real bodily injuries, real traumas that had to be, you know, dealt with. And, you know, as with everything with Miller, you know, this also fit really nicely with the narrative that he had constructed around the Mission Inn, right? It was, and at Mount Rubidoux, with the Catholic imagery and the pomp and circumstance that he could craft around it, because, you know, and perform around it. Because with Miller, you know, you can't separate the business aspect from his other endeavors, because, you know, the promotion of Riverside and the Mission Inn were always at the forefront. So, you know, he's being very reverent about wanting to create this memorial and bringing this piece home to memorialize and have a place of reflection for those that served and died in World War I. But it's also very much, well, but it could also be a great tourist side too for Mount Rubidoux. So yeah, so I think that all connected with how people viewed museums and how objects and artifacts of the past were used at this time, you know, really coalesces in this idea of bringing back, you know, an actual piece to have people be able to come and see. And it, you know, it's interesting because it was never, you know, it didn't come to fruition. It was never used, and then it was kind of, you know, utilized as like a, you know, almost a decoration. It was just kind of put up on an exterior wall for a while and then forgotten. So, you know, there's kind of a little bit of melancholy surrounding that as well.
I think that that's really fascinating in terms of this idea of art and artifact being seen, of course, as a commemoration, but also a way to bring the war home. I also think about how Riverside, of course, is on the West Coast, in so many ways removed from maybe even a lot of just the drama of the era, right? They're not in New York, they're not in Washington, D.C. And so Frank Miller is creating this space through tangible objects that World War One is in people's backyard in ways that it might not have otherwise have been. And thank you, Dr. McEwen. And that sort of brings also another really interesting question about memorials in general and the roles of memorials post-war and actually for some time after World War One. And I was wondering if Drs. Levitch and Moses could sort of chat with us about that there is a very clear politic of memorials post-World War One, both living and commemorative, and communities tried to have a real clear, or tried to have a vision of what they wanted in terms of that memory. But some people would argue that that rollout was not always necessarily strong. Could you guys sort of tell us about how various communities sought to remember and commemorate the World War One experience? And what were the strengths and weaknesses of those various efforts across the nation?
Yeah, I'm happy to dive in first. I think one thing I would say, going back to Emily's comment, and something I did not mention in my talk, but a lot of memorials are built around the weapons of World War One. So sort of captured German howitzers and French 75s that the Americans used, and there are hundreds of these. So there is, I agree with her completely, there's this like overwhelming desire to have something tactile, something haptic that you can actually connect directly to the war. And there was also, on a much smaller scale, I've read accounts of sort of soldiers gathering up sort of pieces of stained glass from cathedrals that were destroyed essentially during the war, especially at Reims. And sort of the Gardner Museum, for instance, has put together, or a soldier had put together 105 fragments from stained glass at the famous Reims Cathedral. And that is now at the Gardner, not as a memorial per se, but obviously as something to recollect the war. As for your other question, the bigger question, I think what strikes me amazingly as I try to sort of keep track of the memorials that were built or that were not built, in many cases, is how local it all was. I mean, it is just down to sort of the very smallest element in society trying to sort of not make their peace, but sort of have their say in terms of what gets commemorated and what doesn't. And and in some ways, which I think I hope I intimated in my talk, I think the war would be better remembered if we all had doughboy sculptures like they did at the Civil War. Like, what that is, you have the iconography. It's not good art. It doesn't mean a lot. But in terms of just sort of, the basic sort of reinforcing of an idea, I'm not sure that would have been of any benefit to anybody. I sort of like the messiness of it all and how it sort of plays out differently. And I also think that had there been the first national war memorial in DC at the time, I don't know if it would have meant that much. Again, we had the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which was sort of the de facto. But if there was something lasting in the capital that had been dedicated to what was then the World War, I think that would have sort of maybe helped keep things a little more in the public eye. I will say, as I as I said in my talk, that, memorials are mostly for the people who build the memorials. They're intended to last. They don't usually last unless they are exceptional for some reason or another. And for them to last, they have to be not only sort of striking for what they are and what they represent, but they have to be like a relationship. They have to be kept alive. They have to be sort of dealt with over and over again. And, I wonder, the Vietnam Memorial on the Mall is sort of the absolute amazing war memorial, the first national war memorial we've had. But, what is that going to look like in 50 years? Who's going to be sort of dealing with that, and in what way? And I will also say that I just saw a talk this evening on Imperial Roman war memorials that sort of traced the history of war memorials. And I was reminded that it was the Greeks who first sort of named people who were killed in battle. They would bury people in a communal burial thing, but they did mark their names on stones. And that, again, is such a link, but something that sort of lays low for a long period until World War I. And that's now become sort of the essence of a war memorial, is that, and I just saw that the Korean War Memorial, again on the Mall, they are about to add the names of all the people who died in the war. That has now become like the emphasis, the absolute intrinsic thing that a memorial must have.
That's really interesting. Oh, go ahead,
Please,
Dr. Moses.
I was going to address this from the point of view of the local story, and Mark's comment about Greece and Rome and the memorials there really ties to Riverside, except we were a Lincoln Roosevelt town, progressive city that went more for a useful community living memorial that would serve a dual purpose. Remind us of the war, but at the same time provide opportunities for conventions, for meeting space, for a useful civic structure, as one of the leaders said about this one. The tie to Greece and Rome, though, is that many of those leaders wanted a building that would be worthy of the Roman imperial builders, Mark. And in choosing the architect for this, they chose an architect who knew the California missions, and he knew classical architecture. He knew that Mission Santa Barbara, the friars at Mission Santa Barbara had referred to Vitruvius, the great Roman architect who was the architect of the Roman imperial builders, and modeled what you see behind me is the Riverside Soldiers Memorial Municipal Auditorium after Mission Santa Barbara to a degree, using modern construction technology, slip form structural concrete to do it. But instead of referencing the specific war dead in Riverside, they use more cryptic and symbolic means of making this a memorial. It was Soldiers Memorial Municipal Auditorium at the behest of Frank Miller's agreement with the city, because he donated the land that enabled the city then to use for the construction of the memorial based on bond sales. Miller wanted a living memorial, naturally, as a businessman, the hotel just right next door, more or less. He wanted that, and at the same time, he wanted a monument to permanent peace. And the initial inscription for the cornerstone said, "A memorial to those who fought to ensure an enduring peace." Somewhere in the negotiations and the competition of interest, that was changed, and the final memorial was to God, country, and all those who have served our country in war. Today, it's known as the Riverside Municipal Auditorium, and there's not much to tell us. This is the World War I memorial in Riverside. There are some cryptic quotes inside on plaques. There are 3 stained glass windows. 2 of them are dedicated to the mission myth, the Spanish colonial myth making. And if you read the artifact behind me, as Emily can do, it's as much Frank Miller's desire to create that Spanish myth for his own purposes as much as the memorial. And 2 of those 3 stained glass windows in front are dedicated to Father Serra and Native Americans, local Indians, and to Spanish coming to California. And one of them is of a soldier and four, a nurse and four uniformed soldiers. Today, this really doesn't tell us much about World War I. A lot of interpretation could be done for that, but it did fit that one major category, not a straight memorial, but a living memorial with a dual function.
As we talk about different types of memorials, post-World War I, particularly in the United States, living memorials versus commemorative memorials, and how often memorials get lost over time and generations to audiences as they change. And I know that some of you are global historians. Are there contrasting examples of how World War I was memorialized, and how the public responded to those memorials?
Can I chime in here?
Sure.
So I'm a French historian by training. It's the country that I know the best, that I've studied the closest. And the contrast here with the United States is actually a very interesting one. Of course, you know, where Americans were counting their dead in the tens of thousands, the French were counting them in the hundreds of thousands and over a million. And that deep-seated connection to the community on the most local level was very apparent in memorialization of this war as well. I don't have the exact figure on the tip of my tongue, but somewhere between 70 to 80,000 monuments aux morts, monuments to the dead, were constructed in France in the decade or so after World War I, most of them grassroots, bottom-up efforts funded often by local communities as well as veterans organizations. And it was interesting to hear Mark say that, kind of retrieved guns and military weaponry were at least thought of as appropriate emblems to incorporate potentially into memorialization. One of the most notable things about French World War I war memorials is their lack of militarism. Sometimes they're outright pacifism. Grieving widows incorporated in terminology. One in one local community, maudite soit la guerre, damned be war, written right on the community's war memorial. Others just simple civic war memorials. And here's where the naming comes in so importantly. It's always the list of names of local men and boys who died in the conflict who show up. But there was this living memory of World War I in France and in Europe that just extended well beyond anything that the United States or Canada or many of these faraway countries, maybe Australia is an exception, experience that made memorialization of this conflict so incredibly important and ingrained in the political culture.
Can I just jump in with a quick comment?
Please.
I think that one of the aspects of memorialization that kind of intersects with a lot of what's been said is what to do with the American battlefield war dead, and the question of, are these bodies going to be repatriated to local communities, to families, to put in family cemeteries, local cemeteries, or will the government be able to put them into national cemeteries to both keep them where they fell, but at the same time fit in with larger policy goals of reminding Americans of their larger global responsibilities, and the French and British of American help by literally having, the physical evidence of that on French soil. And it's interesting that if there's 8 national cemeteries, overseas cemeteries that are created in Belgium and France, and they look ginormous because of the way that they're designed, but in fact, 70% of American families asked for the bodies to be returned at the government's expense. And it was a long, protracted process of reinterring these bodies, identifying them, transporting them. And it, I think to me, showed a lot about the kind of conflicting goals between the government and the locality and the family, because again, families are also important in this mobilization over what to do with the bodies. And I'll just kind of point out that then in the 30s, with the Gold Star Mother pilgrimages, where the government at the height of the Depression funds these trips for mothers, and if the mother's not there, widows, so it's for women who have lost someone, to go to France and visit their loved one's gravesite. And to me, that's an exercise of memorialization. It's very political, it's segregated, that's another important point. And it just shows that even literally, speaking to Emily's point about, you know, the physicality, that you're also talking about what to do with remains, and that it's embedded in a lot of this discussion that plays out at a lot of the levels you've all been pointing to.
And I would also say that a lot of the memorials were erected before bodies were returned. You know, the ones that were put up in the first 2 or 3 years, it took a long time to get the bodies back.
Wow. Thank you guys so much for that. That's an incredible sort of visualization of the politic and the difficulty of constructing memorials, right? And it is very different from, let's say, the Civil War era, World War II, and then of course, Vietnam is its own dynamic. But as we talk about the construction of memory, we also have this reality that when we bring it back to Frank Miller, Frank Miller is bringing back, he's very much so orchestrating World War I memorial and commemoration within Riverside. And so he oversees the civic auditorium. He brings various artifacts back from Europe, but he also is facilitating and bringing the world to Riverside in terms of overseeing this sort of peace movement and making Riverside, maybe for some an unlikely space, very much so influential. And so just sort of broadening, if either Teresa Hanley or Dr. Siegel would like to sort of speak about how Frank Miller brought all of these ideologies, commemoration, even artifacts, but specifically the international peace movement to Riverside. And what did that look like for him? And could you all speak to why that was so important for him?
So I'll start, Mona. Actually, first of all, I also wanted to kind of tag along with Emily's comments, particularly in regard to the comment that you made about artifacts being silent. And I mean, she spoke a lot about what Miller was kind of projecting onto the silent artifact. But in our group project, particularly in regard to the exhibit, one of the things we've really been struggling with is, I'll say, how the facility that Miller had with ambiguity and people from different walks of life, sometimes very contrasting sort of perspectives or backgrounds. And then also this kind of gets a little bit to the business aspects. You know, and we're sort of coming around to the notion that, I mean, he's really operating the way that you would expect a skilled hotel man to act, you know, in all the other aspects. I mean, as a hotel man, you know, he wouldn't necessarily, you know, engage with any kind of controversy of a particular hotel guest. And he also kind of demonstrates that in other aspects of his life. And then to bring that back to the silent artifact, I mean, one thing that kind of follows along with that is that the artifact is silent, but what it allows is every viewer or visitor to imbue it with their own meaning, which is kind of consistent with that, you know, that facility of Miller's in regard to being a hotel man. And I mean, we're really starting, you know, to talk a lot about his comfort with ambiguity. So that's not actually to your point, but it was something that's just kind of brought up to me as Emily was speaking. So, but I do want to say a few words about Frank Miller and peace, because as early as 1911, when he hosted that peace conference at the Mission Inn, there's frequent mentions of something called the Riverside Peace Society in archival correspondence, and sometimes you'll see it in newspaper accounts. But as far as I know, there's no archival records of the group. And even in Miller's own, the hotel archives that we use so much, there's no files on that organization in the same way that there are for some of the other groups and organizations that he was very involved with. So I'm not really sure how organized it was, if it was, I don't want to use the term front, but if it, you know, if it was, you know, a handful of people, or if it was a real group. But even by the time of 1915 and that California Peace Day in the schools, that little pamphlet, it refers to the Riverside Peace Society, not so much to Frank Miller. So it's somehow, you know, it's a real thing. It just may be that whatever records, you know, it may not have generated a lot of records, or they haven't survived. And then in those years leading up to 1914 and the war in Europe, you know, there are occasional accounts of peace speakers coming to the Mission Inn. National speakers, they almost always will speak at the First Congregational Church, and there'll be a reference that he's has invited them, or that he's hosting them at the Mission Inn during their stay. And then I just wanted to reiterate that, I mean, I'm fairly comfortable that where Miller fits is that as a sort of local leader of what Michael Kazin called that war against war in the years right after the start of the war in Europe, and the lobbying to try to keep the United States out of the war and to concentrate on negotiations. So, I mean, during those years, as I said, I think in my talk, he's much more out front than we generally think about him. He's gathering, you know, city officials. There's the mayor, there's the Chamber of Commerce leaders, several different religious leaders, as well as community leaders. One of them I don't think I spoke too much about was the woman named Stella Irvine, who was a national leader in the WCTU, who lived here in Riverside. She was very also out front in peace activities. And the documentation for all of this is pretty much in news accounts. You know, I haven't seen a lot in the way of correspondence between these people, probably because they're local and they saw each other locally. So I can't really gauge if the fact that these community leaders are really supporting this peace rally in the park are because, you know, of Miller's influence on them, or if it's because of, you know, the way in which the notions of peace and the U.S. staying out of the war are more generally accepted or popular at that time. But I would guess that there was a pretty strong peace sentiment among some subset of Riversiders. Maurice Hodgin, who was Miller's most recent biographer when we first started the project, he really cautioned me against trying any kind of interpretation that Riverside was a peace town, he called it. I don't know what exactly that would mean, but and I mean, he emphasized that Miller was respected for his work, but that he was still very much going against the sort of prevailing winds, even locally, with his ideas. And again, the records are scant, but there was some subset of people to, you know, work on the fundraising and the building of that peace tower, because as far as we can tell, it's not something that was generated by Miller. It was generated by people in the community to honor his efforts. And then the last thing I would say, just to go back to that Peace Day in the California schools, because one thing I forgot to say when Mona and I did our talk, when she talked about Fannie Fern Andrews and the curriculum that she developed for different grade levels, and all, that's exactly what that little brochure is. It's all right in there with different types of educational exercises for different class levels. And I mean, the interesting thing here is we again see Miller's contacts and his networking because the state superintendent of schools at the time was a Riverside County education official who Miller had long supported and kind of been a champion of. So, I think there we see his hand, as we often say, kind of behind the scenes on that.
Can I add?
Oh, go ahead. No, please.
I was just going to add one thing to what Teresa was saying when we've, those of us on the planning committee and the exhibit committee, when we've been looking at this, the ambiguity has been difficult to sort of parse through sometimes. And I'm just thinking about the Peace Tower dedicated to Frank Miller and, saying that he's the greatest exemplar of peace. That's some of the language from some of the newspaper accounts from the dedication. But it was really like, okay, but as we've been going through this, like, what does that mean? What, because we, in Riverside especially, we can sort of have this, the man, the myth, Frank Miller attitude. Okay, greatest exemplar of peace. He did all of these things. Okay, but what did he do? What were these things that he did? And, sometimes this ambiguity is so frustrating, and not putting our own feelings of what a peace advocate or activist would look like onto this. And so looking at his networking and looking at the things he did and didn't do, I mean, it's often very, very frustrating, but, to broaden this out into a larger history and see, often it's not just about him, it's about the people that, he surrounded himself with and his networks, and those people, that were potentially influencing and having these great impacts on the peace movement. So
I think that's a perfect bridge. That's where I was headed. Thank you so much. No. Please, all of you jump in. I'm simply the moderator. But from what I understand, listening to earlier lectures within this series, Frank Miller was clearly impacted by influential women. And it is the efforts of these women that he was very supportive of and very tied to. So Professor Siegel, can you tell us about some of these women, their relationship with Frank Miller, their impact on the international peace movement? And I think that kind of will broaden out his legacy, as well as maybe even Riverside's space within this global space, peace movement.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So, I mean, it seems very clear, on a personal level that Frank Miller surrounded himself with, I would just say, even was attracted to some pretty strong women, ambitious women in their own way and in their own age. And then we also know that he played host to some of the most prominent female peace activists, not just of the United States, like Jane Addams and Fannie Fern-Andrews, but also internationally, like Dr. Aletta Jacobs. These are all women that Teresa and I spoke about some weeks ago. And, what's kind of interesting is, despite this professional and also personal connection to these women, from the best we can tell, and Teresa will correct me if I'm wrong here, but she kind of said this at the end of her talk, it does not seem as though Miller himself made the strong connection between feminism and pacifism that most of these female peace activists did. Nor did he necessarily see women's empowerment or women's suffrage as a prerequisite to a peaceful world order, which is exactly what these women of this generation were arguing. And so, in terms of the broader legacy of this moment for women in particular, I thought it was really interesting tonight. Just now, Jennifer started us off talking about, American legacies of World War I, but most of those things that she ticked off, the development of social movements, or kind of catalyzing pre-existing social movements and pushing them down a new road. The advent of Wilsonianism and the idea of an integrated liberal international order, and also the fracturing of empire. You know, a lot of these things we think of in the masculine, and a lot of the history has been written in the masculine, and yet women were absolutely centrally, you know, focused in the public eye and in newspaper headlines and in, you know, the meeting halls at the Paris Peace Conference itself, really advocating for the idea that that war was a male disease, right? That World War I was the result of male statecraft, because despite the fact that women in California could vote in 1914 at the beginning of World War I, very few women anywhere in the world could. And so this was a war that was generated and caused by and fought by men. And women used that, well, they understood that as a inroad and a strategy, as Jennifer also said, for arguing for why women needed to be included as full partners. Of course, granting suffrage at the national level, a fundamental step towards that. But the women that I talked about along with Dr. Davis Hayes the other day were also women from Europe, from Egypt, from China, others we didn't discuss, from India, Korea, all at this time, who were putting forward arguments for a world made safe for democracy, but a world made safe for democracy for all people, regardless of nationality, regardless of race, and regardless of sex. And so I think that the you know, the advent of global feminism as one of the major outcomes of World War I has been just extraordinarily overlooked in the historiography. And the fact that Frank Miller had a hand in that, despite his, you know, lack of enthusiastic embrace of feminism, just by nurturing and nurturing contacts with some of these women, I think is a kind of very interesting connection between local history and global history, which has, I know, been one of the goals of this entire program. So maybe I'll just, I'll stop right there.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. So we have talked about, I'm looking at the time, we have talked about the legacy of World War I. We have talked about the effort to commemorate and memorialize. We talked about Frank Miller, of course, as well as the international peace advocates who impacted him in his own advocacy. So looking at all of these pieces, what does our modern society owe to this moment of radical global change? I know it's a very broad question, right? Radical global change, various feminisms around the world, this idea of bringing the world into, you know, Riverside specifically. So my question is, what is the takeaway that you would want those who are with us this evening to take away from this entire speaker series, or even your research that you've shared with us?
So
Not all at once.
Well, I'll start. Because I love talking about Aletta Jacobs, just because I didn't know who she was when I ran across her name in the Daughter Alice travel diary. And, you know, nowadays a little few swipes on the smartphone and I immediately knew who she was, and was in fact really stunned that that they knew her. And when they were in Amsterdam, they visited with her for several days. And she, I mean, I was actually looking at an entire other line of, you know, inquiry. And so she was really, you know, the pathway for me into the peace movement and Miller's peace activism. So we'd always talked about that. But I hadn't done any personal study to really know what might be there. And as I looked at some of the scholarship and the other, and I began to understand the diversity of peace advocates at that time, then I began to wonder why we never hear about that. You know, we just don't hear about the fact that there was that broad of a peace movement, that somebody like Carnegie and all these religious leaders, and somebody like Miller would be interested in that. So that was interesting to me. So for me, I mean, that would be one thing that I would want people to, take away, is that whatever our current notions are of peace activism, it's not, that wasn't the case in those years before World War I. And then we'll look with the exhibit a little bit more deeply about how the war changed attitudes towards that. And just to bring it right home to the Mission Inn, as an example, why that fabulous peace flag, just was hardly ever seen, after the 20s or so. In fact, to the point that nobody really knew, what it was doing down there, or what it might mean. So that's what I would say.
I guess I'll jump in after Teresa. I did my dissertation on the Mission Inn, and that was many years ago. And I was sort of thinking, I'm done with I'm done with this. And then I started working with Teresa on this project, and I was, really blown away by a lot of the research she had done and connecting the dots. I had known all of these people had been at the Mission Inn. I knew, okay, Jane Addams, and I knew about the peace conference in 1911, and all of these things, but then really connecting the dots with and contextualizing it with what was happening at the time, and sort of the fomenting of some of these peace ideals, it really sort of blew me away again, thinking, oh my gosh, look at all of these, Aletta Jacobs and Jane Addams, and all of these people that he is connected to and potentially learning from, and just having that network. And then my research really concentrated on a lot of the objects and the art and artifact collections, and then to layer this on top of all of the international collecting that he was doing, really paints a much larger, broader picture. And so it, just adding this other layer of internationalism, and once again, how at the Mission Inn you can really have all of these stories to tell these much broader histories, looking at just different corners of the site. And it's just exciting to keep bringing new stories out that haven't necessarily been told.
I guess I'll jump in. I mean, although my presentation was was much broader and more about kind of big patterns in the war. But I think that what I would say is that I used to talk a lot. I did a lot of talks during the centennial, and I used to always start out by saying, like, who cares that this happened 100 years ago? Because just because something happened 100 years ago, does that really mean we should remember it now? Like, does the accident of the calendar suddenly make World War I important? When it's 101 years ago, it's not important. And when it's 98 years ago, it's even less important. Like, what makes it important now? And I think that that a lot of the questions that we see Americans grappling with in the First World War, we're grappling with as well. And the questions about race relations, about female empowerment, that we've talked a lot, we've heard a lot about this here. Why do we fight wars? Why do we try to create peace through war, and believe that in fact, war can become this positive good in which we eliminate problems as opposed to creating new ones? And how do we balance civil liberties with national security concerns? And I think that this is such a part of the last 10 years that in fact it makes the First World Wars a much more important conflict in some respects than maybe other conflicts at this particular historical moment, because the questions we have were the similar questions they have, and that drives new inquiry into that period of history. And I think that we can never remember everything, and we can't tell everybody's story. So a lot of times what we choose to interrogate about the past says a lot about us and what we're worried about and what our concerns are. And I think that we see that in a lot of the new scholarship and conferences like this that came out of the centennial moment that make studying it relevant. So I'm never persuaded by the, oh, we never knew that, because we don't know a lot of things. We can't tell every story. But to me, like when I listen to a lot of, well, everything that's been said over the course of this conference, I see I can see the connections. Like, why do we need to know? And why do we need to know that women were at the Paris Peace Conference? I mean, we know what, right? That's an important thing to know. It's because it tells us something about the long influence, impact that women have had politically and nationally as well as internationally. By not knowing that, we fail to appreciate the historical roots that we're building on in our own lives. And I think that, I could go on and on, but you see my point, that I never liked the, oh, it's a centennial, so let's have a conference. I'm not sure that was I'm not sure your motivation, but to me, you always need to have a reason, and there were good reasons. And that's why I would argue that these kinds of conversations are so important, because they've demonstrated that to us.
Thank you.
Maybe can I just piggyback just with 2 extra sentences on there, which is, we've talked about who had a voice, whether, in the war or in the peace conference or in memorialization later. But it's also a question of what they were saying and what they were talking about. And, I think one of the things that, World War I was the first world war. The United States, avoided it, but then jumped in head first, and has lived with that legacy ever since. And so I would say, you kind of posed what are the big lasting legacies of this moment for all of us. The globalization to some degree. I mean, you can trace globalization at any point in time that you want to, almost, but this sense that global peace and security can't be rooted in any one place or any one nation, but that we're all in it together. One of the small things that came out in our discussion the other day was that women were advocating for essentially a World Health Organization as part of the establishment of lasting peace. And here we sit in the middle of a global pandemic, just like they sat 100 years ago, looking at what ways that might destabilize the global order. So, I think just, the fact that we're all in this small world together, whether we're in it together peacefully and cooperating, or really looking out only for our national self-interests, is still very much a debate that's raging today.
Amazing. Mark or Vince?
I just want to thank everybody for what they said. I agree totally and wholeheartedly. And I've really enjoyed this and getting to see from the micro to the macro. It's been great. Thank you.
Well, I'll second what Mark said and what all of you have preceded him in saying. For me personally, this project has brought, I think, forward a body of knowledge about Miller and some of the great female leaders of the time, especially in the peace movement. This is a story that hadn't been told about him yet, or it's kind of shining a really nice light on more of him. He once said that, Teresa, you have to correct me, this is a paraphrase, that he was run by women. Not only was the hotel run by women, but he's run by women. His sister, his daughter, all these influential women that he had contact with throughout the world. So I think that this project is really good in that regard, and in bringing back a subject matter that still pertains today in the potential destabilization of the world. And this whole project was kicked off by Dr. Roger Ransom from UC Riverside, emeritus professor. He was going to really discuss bilateralism versus a unilateral kind of approach to international relations and the like. He didn't quite get to that. He was doing some other stuff, but these are questions that still pertain today and are very present with us. And I hope, Teresa, this exhibit and the conference have helped launch a conversation about that fact. And we're just now back in Europe talking with the Iranians again about the nuclear deal, which was a 6-country deal, not just America first and Iran, but it was a 6-country deal. So these issues are still directly in front of us. So that's that.
If I may add, just listening to all of your lectures over the past number of weeks, what my takeaway, and it's such a local takeaway, is that when I teach historical research and writing to my students, one of the things that I require them to do is use local Riverside, City of Riverside or Riverside County archives. And they also often say, oh, they sigh and they groan and they say, but nothing happens here. Nothing's ever happened here. And I say, oh, no. I think that you'll be very surprised, and that very often local history is a gateway to further understanding national history and global histories as well. And I'm just grateful as a professor of young people who aspire to be within the field, that you all are demonstrating the realities of this, that you start locally in Riverside, let's say for an example, and using World War I as a focus, and then being able to see the world open up for you. And then that's just absolutely stunning. So the next time they moan and groan, I will use this speaker series as an example. Some of them say, oh, I love to be a European historian. I don't see why I would have to ever use any archive in Riverside. And this is just
correction.
Yes.
To my comments, I used the term unilateral. I meant multilateral. I'm sorry.
Oh no, we followed you.
Good.
Yeah. We followed you.
I realized I shut myself down.
But for the record, yes, I understand. So I just want to thank you all for your amazing work and your incredible presentations. And I think with that, Teresa, I can hand it over to you to open up to audience questions.
As soon as I remember to unmute myself, that would be great. So so for all of our audience members, we do have a few questions, but there's still some time to submit questions through the Q&A. So if something has occurred to you and you haven't quite gotten it submitted, please go ahead and do that. So the first question that we have comes from Nancy Cox, and it's for Mark Levitch. And she asks for your email, which I will make sure that she gets. But she is asking about the memorial trees at the Texas A&M, because she said, oh, sorry, there's my neighbor with his motorcycle. I hope you're not hearing that. One of those who died from the 1918 flu pandemic was an instructor at March Field in Riverside and is buried at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery in Riverside. Nancy's a docent at the Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. I found a reference that indicated Connie Uncas Woodman may or may not have had a memorial tree dedicated to him with other Aggies who died during the war. So I don't know if that's a question exactly. Mark, do you know something about the memorial trees at Texas A&M?
I know Texas A&M is very serious about its World War I memorialization. I can't remember if there are trees. I know there's 55 something stones or trees, or and they conduct ceremonies there. It's a very central part of their culture.
Good. Okay, so this has come in two questions, kind of a long one, and then the question. This is from Peter Kalman to all. The living memory of the Great War, World War I, is still very much a part of today's French culture. When I told a French friend that my grandfather had been seriously wounded at Chateau Thierry, he told me that school children take an annual field trip to place flowers on the memorials and graves there. Do we see anything like this in the US?
Before I let my US colleagues respond, can I say something about France? Because my first book I wrote actually was about school teachers, children, and pacifism in France from World War I to World War II. And so the idea of including school children in November 11th ceremonies, and in ceremonies dedicating war monuments, and then in ongoing commemorations of the war, was a very deliberate strategy after World War I to enshrine a national memory, but also to pass it on to a new generation. And so it's interesting that you're still hearing remnants of that today. Again, just to bring it back to the peace movement, though, one of the things that, well, the reason I wrote the whole book is that school teachers in France in the 1920s and 30s became very pacifist. And in fact, there were a number of people in France and outside who blamed them for France's defeat in World War II, that they had like failed to inculcate patriotism in young French children, which I dispute in my book. But it is undoubtedly true that making school children part of the pageantry of memory in France was inculcated from the years immediately after the war. And so it's interesting to me to hear that you're still, seeing traces of that going on today.
Okay, thank you. So from Felicia Kelly, really more of a comment. Bravo, thank you all so much. This has been an incredibly rich conversation. I love the way you've brought history to life and drawn out the connections between past and present in such a powerful way. These issues are central to our lives and the challenges we face locally, nationally, and globally. Congratulations on the entire series, and I look forward to visiting the exhibit when possible. So thank you for that, Felicia. And from Rose Monhay, there was so much discrimination in Riverside towards non-whites at the turn of the century. Did Frank Miller ever advocate for social justice within the community, and how did he relate to the common folk? So I'll see if Vince or Emily want to start with that.
Right. I'll take a crack at that first. Let me give you one example of Frank Miller's work, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes out front. Jukichi and Ken Harada were Japanese immigrants to Riverside, and they purchased a home in the names of their 3 natural-born citizens under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Frank Miller supported them when a suit was brought against them, and when the state of California tried to pursue them under the alien land law. Miller backed them, even though his very good friend was Miguel Estudillo, who was city attorney for the city of Riverside at the time. It's ironic because Miguel Estudillo was one of the original families, Spanish families that came up with the missionaries and the soldiers to Alta California. That's one example of Miller's work on behalf of another community, non-white community, under assault by the state of California. The judge ruled in favor of the 3 children and packed up the tent, went back to Sacramento. But that's an example of Miller's work. He was supporting the Harada family in that endeavor. And there are other examples too. He brought Booker T. Washington to Riverside. He housed him at the Mission Inn. He took him to the First Congregational Church and then the Black churches in town to raise funds. And I'm sure Emily has got a lot more stories about that. But Miller he had some Quaker background from his family, friends. And then First Congregational Church, you have to kind of see him as one of the, from a religious standpoint, one of the kind of social justice oriented individuals in town from a leadership position. As a hotel man, though, as Teresa and Emily pointed out, he had a tendency to be able to handle all sorts of ambiguity and not be the most assertive out front individual on issues like this, but he could certainly make his position known.
I guess I'll jump in a little bit. Yeah, I think Vince is absolutely right with his assessment. And then, we have other things that are sort of going on too that, we need to place him within the context in which he was living. And so you have the other examples like his involvement with the Sherman, then boarding school, and his role in bringing that to Riverside. And, I always think about think about that and the way in which, often he utilized, for lack of a better term, some of the Native American students is, often like a prop almost, to play a character for, Christmas pageant or nativity play. And so you have, you have that other situation. He had he was going to bring a village, an Indian village, a Pueblo village to Riverside. This is another thing during this time actually that didn't come to fruition, but he wanted Sherman students to actually live there, to play the part. So then we have all of these complications too that we need to make sure that we don't place this sainthood upon him. There were complicated racial ethnic things going on, that, and he did speak up in certain instances. I'm sure in other instances that was not the case. So those are just sort of two examples of a complicated person within this time period.
So Vince, did you want to respond to that, or I can?
Please.
Well, I'm certainly not in the business of canonizing Frank Miller, but one thing I just is particularly in regard to Sherman Institute, because I know it's very uncomfortable for us as historians, but I always try to just think about what Lorraine Sisquock and some of the other Native teachers and administrators at Sherman are doing now in regard to developing really Native-centered curriculum. And also, I just happened to have NPR on one day, and there was a speaker talking about the various efforts to redevelop or reconnect with Native languages. And they were talking about the one of the tools for that, one of the great resources for that are the wax cylinders that are at the Southwest Museum. And they played a part of it, and it was Lummis himself right on there saying, here we are at the Riverside Mission Inn with these Native leaders, and then they're all speaking languages, and that's one of the Native languages, and that's one of the ways that those who are trying to reconstruct Native languages today are able to actually hear some languages that people don't speak anymore. So I think that's why we do history. That's why we keep living, because we all have a chance, to do something different than those in the past. And I think it's. Let me just leave it with that. I think it's important to understand those ambiguities, and also as we deal with ambiguities in our own times. So we have another question. So we have another question from Eric Beecham, and he has a bit of a comment first. So I think Frank pursued peaceful resolution of conflict through peace conferences, but also through his incredible collection of artifacts that he thought would encourage conversations between guests and visitors. The result would be increased understandings between others. Would you say that artifacts can stimulate empathy?
I guess I'll take this one. Yeah, I mean, and the Mission Inn is, is an interesting case study because there is that function, and one of the things that we always talk about with the Mission Inn, especially in local history, that it fostered international understanding, that these collections, bringing things from the far-flung reaches of the world, fostered, brought the world to Riverside in a way that people could come and see things from across Europe and Spain and Asia, right? And I think in a way, yes, that did happen. But then in a way, no. I think when you kind of dig in to how some of the artifacts were discussed, right? Because they weren't, so the artifact was, was silent, we could say, but then, they were, Miller and his daughter and son-in-law and Francis Borton, they created all of these curatorial guides, all of these pamphlets that told visitors about these different artifacts. And so the way in which they would discuss the specific artifacts often didn't, I think, foster cultural understanding. It actually fostered a sense of difference, right? A sense of otherness often, to these other international cultures, especially when we're looking at Native American artifacts from Asia. There's this layer of Orientalism around, especially some of the Asian objects at this time. So so it can, and I think in some instances it did, and then in some instances it, kind of really emphasized the difference and the otherness. So I think, it could swing both ways in how those objects were interpreted, and those interpretations certainly change over time.
So did anyone else want to comment on that? No? Well, you know what? We are running up on 7:20 and we have one question that might be a really good final question. Kenya, did you have anything that you wanted to bring us to discuss before we kind of go to this last question?
No, I think that I thought we were going to use this time for audience questions.
So Joan Donahue says, why are we taught so little and know so little about World War I? Was World War II so horrific that the lessons of World War I became immaterial?
Can I start with that one?
Yes, please.
I definitely think there's something to that just the sheer enormity of World War II really kind of sense took over, even from the, you have to remember that a lot of the people that experienced World War II also experienced World War I. So you had a generation, and you certainly had a generation of fathers and sons who really saw these experiences as linked, and a sense of it being the kind of, part two of a previous conflict. So I do think that definitely played a part in the memory, just the sheer numbers, in terms of manpower and deaths and the extent of the war. But I also think that, as this conversation has kind of revealed, it's very difficult to have a shorthand understanding of the First World War. So you can look at, we kind of like to think, okay, like what's the soundbite moment? And, World War II, good war, which you can debate, but it's a simplistic way of understanding why the war needed to be fought, the outcome of it, defeat fascism, end the Holocaust, and we sort of greatest generation, and we sort of believe we know it. Civil War and slavery, save the Union, again, kind of a shorthand way of understanding it. It's really difficult with the First World War. It's difficult to explain why it started, what it was about, how we entered, what came about from the war. I mean, people always ask me, why did the First World War occur? And I say, sit down. so it's, I think that makes it, that's part of the problem as well. And of course, I always say, and I think this panel has demonstrated it, the First World War was not forgotten for 20 years. For the generation, the 20s and 30s, this was the war. They believed they had lived through a singular historic event. It was commemorated that way. It was remembered that way. It influenced policy that way. It was not forgotten. That forgetting was a process that did definitely occur after the Second World War. And we've begun recovering that memory and seeing how that forgetting is a process, just like remembering is a process, and you can undo that process. And I think we gave a lot of valid reasons for why now is the moment to really, for once and for all, put aside the notion that World War I did not matter for the United States.
Anyone else? That sounds like a really great place to end. So I just want to say thank you all so much. Thanks to our attendees, our viewers, and our questioners. We've had wonderful participation. all along, great questions to add to our discussions. So remember my comments from the beginning. Our next phase, really, we will be developing a series of activities, community forum discussions in which we'll be exploring some of these issues and what Miller's legacy might mean for us today as individuals and as a community. And so for those of you who've been with us all along, keep watch for those new activities, because we, as I said, we will need you to help us discuss and work through some of those ideas. So thank you all, and everyone have a pleasant evening. Yay!
Thank you, everybody.